When her husband disappeared, no one noticed until his wedding ring appeared in a customer's slice. The butcher's bride who sold human sausage, 1878 Louisiana. When Clara's husband, Edward, mysteriously disappeared, no one suspected foul play, not at first. But everything changed when a customer discovered his wedding ring inside a sausage. No one knew where Edward went or what had happened to him. But the grisly discovery would unravel a terrifying truth. Clara wasn't just a grieving wife. She was a woman who had lost herself in a maddening obsession. What really happened to her husband? And how far would Clara go to protect a secret that would destroy everything? Clara stood in the butcher's shop, the knife gripped tightly in her hand as she prepared the day's cuts. It was the same routine every morning, just like any other day. The smells of fresh meat, the rhythmic sound of the blade cutting through flesh, it was familiar, comforting even. But today something felt wrong. Edward, her husband, hadn't come in yet. He was always early, always by her side, working the counter, sharpening the knives. But today, nothing. She glanced at the clock. He was never late. Clara tried to push it aside. Edward was probably just delayed, handling some business in the back or meeting someone. But when the minutes stretched into hours, doubt began to creep in. She called out for him, but only silence answered her. The stillness of the shop felt suffocating, like the air itself was thickening, pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced with worries, none of which made sense. She tried to focus, to keep the shop running, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But Clara knew deep down that something wasn't right. When evening arrived, still no word from Edward. Clara closed the shop alone, a strange sense of unease gnawing at her. She had tried calling his name through the back door, even walked to the small apartment they kept above the shop, but found no trace of him. His bed was untouched, his coat hung neatly by the door. It was as if he had simply vanished. The next morning, Clara stood at the counter staring at the empty shop. Her husband was still missing. The townspeople seemed to brush it off, assuming he'd taken a short trip or gone off on some errand. "He'll come back soon," they said. "Don't worry about it, Clara." They offered empty assurances as they walked away, not realizing the growing panic bubbling inside her. But it wasn't just the disappearance that troubled Clara. It was the things she started to notice around the shop, the small, almost insignificant details that no one else seemed to see. The butcher's knife, for one. The blade was out of place, wedged awkwardly between two blocks of meat. Clara hadn't left it like that. In fact, she never let the knives rest anywhere except in their proper spots, neatly arranged on the wall. Yet here it was haphazardly, left behind, smeared with something dark, something fresh. She wiped it off, trying to ignore the chill, creeping up her spine. But the unease only grew as the days passed. Edward never answered her calls. No one knew where he had gone. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Clara tried to continue as if nothing had happened, but the tension in the air was unbearable. She couldn't focus on her work anymore. Every time she picked up the knife, it felt heavier, more dangerous. The bloodstains on the butcher's apron seemed to mock her, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to keep going. She had to keep the shop running. It was all she had left. And then, a week later, the first sign appeared. Clara was in the back organizing supplies when she heard the soft thud of something hitting the counter. She turned to find a small package wrapped in brown paper, sitting alone on the butcher's block. She hadn't heard the door open. No one had come in. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she carefully unwrapped the package, her hands shaking. Inside there was a small blood-stained apron-board apron. She had seen it countless times before. It was his, without a doubt. But the blood was fresh, soaking through the fabric. Clara's mind raced. Where had this come from? Why was it here? Was it a message? The questions consumed her. She couldn't stop staring at the apron, the blood soaking into the fabric as though it had been purposely left for her to find. It felt like a sign, a clue to something she wasn't yet ready to understand. Clara began to search the shop frantically, lifting floorboards, moving crates, and looking in every corner for any trace of her husband. She needed to know the truth. Had Edward been taken? Had something happened to him? Her hands trembled as she tore through the butcher's shelves, throwing items aside in desperation. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but her gut told her she had to keep searching. Finally, her eyes landed on something that made her blood run cold, a small blood-stained ring lying on the butcher's block. Edward's wedding ring. Clara's heart stopped. She didn't want to believe it, but there it was. His ring, the one he had worn for years. It was crushed, twisted, as though someone had mashed it into the meat itself. The room spun. Clara couldn't breathe. The blood drained from her face as the truth started to sink in. Edward wasn't missing. He was gone dead, and the proof was right in front of her. Her legs buckled beneath her as she sank to the floor, clutching the ring in her hand. She couldn't stop shaking. She couldn't breathe. Had she done this? Had she killed him? The thought screamed through her mind, but she couldn't remember anything. She couldn't remember what had happened. The days leading up to his disappearance were a blur, a haze of confusion and doubt. Was this her fault? Had she been the one to end his life? She couldn't answer that question. Not yet. But Clara knew, deep in her gut, that the truth was much darker than she could have ever imagined. The butcher's shop, once a place of comfort, was now the scene of an unspeakable crime. Clara's mind raced as she tried to piece it together, but the fragments refused to form a coherent picture. Who could have done this? Who could have taken Edward, and why? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the answer might be closer than she wanted to believe. But Clara wasn't done yet. The discovery of the ring was just the beginning. The truth would soon become far more horrifying than she ever imagined, and it would tear her life apart piece by piece. Clara's mind was spinning, her pulse racing as she sat in the butcher's shop, clutching Edward's wedding ring in her hand. It felt like everything she knew had been ripped away, leaving behind a hollow space filled with fear and confusion. The ring, crushed and stained with blood, was all the proof she needed. Her husband was gone, but how and why? Her hands shook as she turned the ring over and over, as if she could somehow find the answers hidden within its cold, twisted metal. She tried to steady herself, but the more she thought, the more her thoughts seemed to fracture. She couldn't remember the night Edward had disappeared. Everything after the last argument they'd had seemed to blur together, like a fog over her memories. The questions gnawed at her. Had she killed him? Had they fought, and in a fit of rage, had she done something she couldn't remember? Was this her fault? Or had someone else done this? But who? And why would they leave this ring behind? Clara pushed herself to her feet, the walls of the shop closing in on her. She needed answers, but every time she thought she might understand the situation, new, darker questions surfaced. Every corner of the shop seemed to whisper something, some hint of truth, yet she couldn't piece it all together. The shop suddenly felt colder, the air thick with something she couldn't describe. The familiar clatter of the meat cleavers, the satisfying thud of knives chopping, now felt like an ominous reminder of the danger that lurked in her own home. The Edward's ring was still in her hand. She walked to the back of the shop, her footsteps echoing through the empty space. Her thoughts were clouded with anxiety and dread, but her instinct urged her to search further. She had to know what had happened to him. She couldn't live in this fog of uncertainty. In the back room, Clara began to tear through every drawer, every box, searching for anything that might explain what had happened. The shop was always meticulously organized. Edward had insisted on it. But today, everything felt wrong. Things were out of place. The knives, usually so sharp and neatly arranged, were scattered across the counters. Some of them had dried blood on them. Her heart sank as she realized that this blood wasn't from the animals they usually slaughtered. It was human blood. Suddenly, a sound behind her caught her attention. It was a soft noise, like a scrape against the floor. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned. Slowly, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. But there was no one there. Only the shadows stretching across the cold stone floor. She shook her head, trying to clear the panic setting in. It was just her imagination. Her mind was playing tricks on her. She had to focus. But what was she looking for? And why did it feel like someone, was watching her? Clara continued her search, her fingers trembling as she moved through the crates and shelves. The room seemed to grow colder by the second. And then, just as she was about to give up, something caught her eye, a small, hidden compartment under one of the butcheress blocks. It wasn't visible at first, but Clara's intuition pushed her forward. She knelt down, prying it open, and inside, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a small bundle of papers, tied with a piece of string. Clara opened it, her heart pounding in her chest. As she scanned the first few lines, her stomach twisted. The papers were from Edward. He had written them just before he vanished. The words on the page made Clara's skin crawl. "I've done things I can't undo. It's too late for me now, Clara. You'll never understand, but the shop can never be sold. It's too important. Trust no one. You will have to carry on." The letter was barely legible, as though Edward had written it in a frenzy, the ink smudged in places. Clara read it again, trying to make sense of what it meant. What was he talking about? What had he done? The words echoed in her mind as she tried to piece them together. The shop can never be sold. She ran the words through her mind. Carry on? What did he mean by that? Clara was gripped by a sense of dread that surged through her entire body. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was something planned, something premeditated. Edward had known something, and now it was too late to stop it. She was being drawn into something much darker than she could ever have imagined. Her hands trembled as she clutched the papers. She scanned the rest of the letter, but there were no more answers, no more explanations, nothing that could tell her what to do next. Clara collapsed onto the floor, her mind racing. She thought back to the oddities she had noticed in the Shoptward's absence, the strange items, the disturbing mess that seemed to haunt every corner. Had Edward been preparing her for something? Then something else occurred to her, a horrifying thought that made her stomach lurch. Had she been involved in whatever had happened to Edward? Was she the one who had butchered him? She couldn't remember it, but that ring. The thought consumed her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door creaking open. Clara stood up, quickly stuffing the papers back into the compartment. Who could it be? She turned to face the door, her heart in her throat, but there was no one there, just the quiet, oppressive stillness of the shop. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked again, and this time Clara didn't have to guess. Someone was in the shop, someone who had been here the whole time. Before she could react, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Clara, I knew you'd find it eventually." Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was familiar, haunting, and filled with something malevolent. It was Edward's voice, but it was twisted, distorted. Clara took a step back, her body frozen. But the shadow in the corner shifted, and a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Edward, or what was left of him. His face was pale, gaunt, and his eyes empty, hollow, and dead. Clara gasped, her heart racing in terror. But then, before she could scream, Edward's lips curled into a twisted grin. "You should have known, Clara," he whispered. "The shop was never yours to begin with." Clara's world had just cracked open. The man she thought was dead was standing right in front of her. But what he revealed next would break her completely. The nightmare had only just begun. Clara's body was frozen in place, her breath shallow as she stared at the ghostly figure in front of her. Edward's face pale, gaunt, eyes hollow was unmistakable. But the man standing before her was not the Edward she knew. The twisted grin on his face, the chill in the air, it all screamed something darker, something far more sinister. Clara, his voice slithered out like a whisper, but it was as if the words were filled with a hidden poison. You should have known better. Her heart pounded in her chest, the thud deafening in her ears. She could barely comprehend what was happening. Was this some kind of sick joke, a twisted illusion? She had just discovered his ring in the meat. He had been dead for over a week, but there he was alive, or at least something that looked like him. I don't understand. How? She stammered, taking a tentative step back. Eduardo, whatever this thing was, chuckled softly. You never understood, Clara. You never looked close enough. But you will. You'll see soon enough. Clara's mind was spinning, trying to connect the dots to understand how this nightmare could be real. She looked at the blood-stained knife in her hand, the metal glinting in the dim light. Was this some kind of sick game? Had she really butchered him, or was this all part of some sick, twisted plan that she was only now beginning to see? Why didn't you tell me? Clara's voice cracked as the realization slowly began to form. Why did you leave me alone with this? Edward, if that was even his real name anymore, took a step forward, his expression darkening. Because you had to learn. You had to see the truth, Clara. I've been preparing you for this. The butcher's legacy, it's yours now. It always was. Clara's knees buckled as she sank to the floor. Her hands shook violently, and she struggled to hold herself together. What are you talking about? What legacy? I don't understand. Edward's eyes darkened and his voice dropped into a dangerous whisper. The shop, the meat, the secret that's been passed down for generations. It was never meant to be just a butcher shop, Clara. It was always about something much darker. Clara's blood ran cold. Something darker? The weight of his words settled into her chest like a heavy stone. The butcher shop had always been their life, their work. But now, every piece of meat, every bloody knife, every pound of sausage felt like something she could never wash off her skin. She had always trusted Edward. He was her husband, the man she married. How could this be happening? No, she shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. You're dead, you're gone. I buried you. I never. Edward's grin widened. You didn't bury me, you never even got the chance. Clara's blood turned to ice as the implications hit her. She looked around the shop, her mind racing, her thoughts tangled. But the blood in the meat, the wedding ring and the sausage, it was, you wasn't it? You're not dead. You've been here all along." A sick realization clawed at her gut. Had Edward orchestrated his own disappearance? Had he tricked her into believing he was dead, leaving her to take the fall for a crime she never committed? He nodded slowly, his eyes glinting with malice. "You've been part of the plan all along, Clara. The ring was the final touch. It wasn't just a message, it was your initiation." He stepped closer, his presence suffocating her. "I knew you'd follow. I knew you'd obsess. You always were the perfect accomplice." Clara's heart stopped. "Accomplice?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "You think I'm part of this?" No, I didn't do anything. You did more than you think." Edward's voice was like ice, and the words cut deep into her soul. "You've been butchering people for weeks now, Clara. The meat, the sausages, it wasn't just pig you were cutting." Clara recoiled as if struck. The room seemed to close in around her. Her breathing quickened. Her mind felt like it was shattering into pieces. No, that's not true. That's not possible. I would never," but Edward's smile never faltered. "You're not a fool, Clara. You're smarter than that. The taste, the smell, it was never just animal. I needed you to take over. I needed you to continue the work." Clara's mind reeled as the horrifying truth slowly, inevitably sank in. The whispers in the back of her mind, the bloodstains on the knives, the oddity of the shop's endless supply of meat, the customers who never asked questions saw all of it. It had always been part of Edward's twisted plan. The sausages weren't just made from pigs. Her stomach churned violently, and she felt like she was going to collapse. "No, please." No, Edward stepped forward, his voice growing colder. "It's done, Clara. You've already taken the first step. The shop is yours now. There's no escaping it. You'll keep the legacy alive, just like I always knew you would." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she slowly backed away, trying to distance herself from the nightmare unfolding in front of her. "You did this. You made me a part of this horror." Edward's gaze softened for a moment, almost as if he were pitying her. "I didn't make you, Clara. You've always been this way. You just needed a little push." Clara was on the verge of breaking. Her mind was collapsing under the weight of the truth. She had been the one who made the sausages. She had been the one selling them. The meat, it wasn't pig, it was human. The realization was so overwhelming that it felt like the world itself was shattering around her. She fell to her knees, her body racked with sobs. No, this can't be true." "I didn't." Edward's laugh echoed through the butcher's shop, and the sound twisted in Clara's ears. "You were always so perfect for this job, Clara. So meticulous, so precise, but you never asked the right questions." Clara couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. The truth was too much to bear. She had been part of something unspeakable, and she didn't even know it. Edward moved closer, his voice a dark promise. "This is only the beginning, Clara. The shop will always be here, and now it's your turn to make sure it never ends." Clara had just discovered the horrifying truth about her involvement in the butcher's legacy, but there was still more she hadn't uncovered. What would she do now that she was part of Edward's twisted game? The worst was yet to come. Clara's knees trembled as she sat on the cold floor, the weight of Edward's words pressing down on her chest like a leaden weight. The butcher's shop, once a place of routine, now felt like a prisoner prison. She stared at the blood-stained knife in her hand, the one she had used to prepare the meat, the one that had become too familiar, too heavy with guilt. Edward's twisted revelation still echoed in her mind, each word an unshakable truth that tore through her sanity. She had been part of something far darker than she could ever have imagined. She had butchered people. She had sold human meat to the very town that had once trusted her. The room felt suffocating, the silence unbearable. Every breath Clara took felt like she was inhaling the very stench of death that now surrounded her. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, a tornado of horror and disbelief, spinning faster and faster until she couldn't tell which way was up. And then, there it was again, the whisper. Clara, her heart skipped a beat as the voice slithered into her ears, cold and hollow. It was familiar, too familiar, Edward's voice. But he wasn't here. He couldn't be. She had seen him standing in front of her, alive or whatever he was. She had heard him. He had spoken the truth, the terrifying, sickening truth. But now the voice was soft, almost tender. It was as if he were right behind her, whispering from the shadows. Clara, her pulse quickened. She turned slowly, her eyes darting around the room. The butcher's shop was silent again, the shadows long and stretching, creeping across the floor like they were alive. The knife in her hand seemed to grow heavier by the... She couldn't stop herself from trembling, from feeling the cold sweat trickle down her spine. "Clara," the voice whispered again, this time louder, more insistent. "You know what you have to do." Clara spun around, but there was no one. No shadow, no ghost, just the empty room, the empty shop, and the crushing weight of her thoughts. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her mind racing to keep up with the terror that was building inside her. She had to leave. She had to get out of here. This place of Butcher's shop wasn't just a shop anymore. It was a tomb, a twisted shrine to Edward's legacy, her legacy. She was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape, bound by the blood on her hands. But the whispers kept coming. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It was everywhere. The walls seemed to whisper. The floorboards creaked with secrets. The very air in the room felt thick with something malevolent. "Clara, why are you running?" Edward's voice again, clearer now, but still distant, like it was coming from all directions at once. She staggered backward, almost tripping over a butcher's table. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could hear was Edward's voice, his haunting words repeating in her mind like a broken record. The whispers never stopped. They were inescapable, relentless. "Clara, Clara," screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "Leave me alone!" Her words echoed off the walls, but they did nothing to silence the voice in her head. But then, as if on cue, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, a void that swallowed her whole. Clara stood frozen in place, staring at the empty room, waiting for something he think to happen. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. And then, as she turned to leave, she saw it. On the butcher's table, the meat neatly wrapped and prepared was now a grotesque, monstrous pile. The flesh was no longer just animal. It was human, unmistakably so. It was Edward's face staring back at her. His eyes, lifeless and dead, had been carved into the flesh, his features twisted into a grotesque, horrifying mockery of the man she had known. Clara gasped, stumbling backward. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker, more suffocating. She shook her head, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as she stepped closer, she could smell an unmistakable stench of death. The meat on the table was still warm, as if it had been freshly butchered. Clara's stomach turned violently. She felt like she was going to be sick. "No, no, no, no," she whispered the words, her voice shaking as her eyes scanned the room. But there was no escape from the nightmare. Clara's eyes landed on the small wooden shelf near the back of the room. A collection of jars sat there, their contents sealed tightly within. She stepped forward, her body moving on its own accord, as if some invisible force was pulling her toward them. Her trembling hand reached for one of the jars, and as she lifted it from the shelf, she felt the unmistakable weight of something inside. She hesitated for a moment before unscrewing the lid. The contents inside made her blood run cold. Edward's wedding ring, the same ring that had been found in the sausage, the same ring that had once been his symbol of love. Now, it sat in the jar, suspended in a viscous liquid, a twisted memento of her husband's death. Clara stumbled backward, the jar slipping from her fingers and crashing to the floor, its contents spilling out. The ring rolled across the floor, coming to a stop at her feet. She couldn't breathe. The weight of what she was seeing crushed her chest. This was real. She looked down at the jar on the ground, the blood-like liquid pooling around it. The ring, soaked in that same liquid, was a reminder of everything she had lost, of everything she had become. The whispers began again, louder this time, more frantic. Clara couldn't escape it. The ghost of Edward, the real Edward, had been gone. But this thing in front of her was not him. It was something worse, something far darker. Suddenly, she realized, Edward had never truly left. He had been here the whole time, and now the butcher's legacy was her curse to bear. Clara had just uncovered the horror of what had been happening all along, but was it too late for her to escape? The whispers were growing louder. The truth was consuming her, and the butcher's shop was far from finished with her yet. Clara stumbled back from the butcher's table, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before her. The meat, still warm, had Edward's face twisted into an obscene mockery of the man she once knew. The reality of the shop, of her life, was slipping away. It was as though the world had tilted on its axis, and now everything she thought she knew, everything she had trusted, was being dragged into a dark abyss. She staggered to the door, her breath ragged and desperate. She had to get out. She had to leave this place, this nightmare, behind her. But as she reached the door, it wouldn't open. The latch refused to budge, as if someone was holding it shut from the other side. "Clara," the whisper came again, and this time it was closer, so close it felt as though it was right next to her ear. Her heart thundered in her chest. but she forced herself to turn around. The shop was eerily quiet, the shadows playing tricks on her mind. Every corner of the room seemed to hide something of presence she couldn't see but felt all around her. "Edward," she whispered, barely able to form the word. Is this your doing?" There was no answer, only the sickening stillness of the room. The knives on the counter, once so familiar, now seemed like weapons of torture. The walls, covered in bloodstains, felt alive, pulsing with the echoes of the screams Clara couldn't remember. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door again, trying to will herself to break free. But before she could force it open, the air around her thickened, the temperature dropped, and Clara's breath became visible in the cold air. She looked down, her chest tightening as the floor beneath her feet seemed to shift. It was as if the shop itself was alive and hungry. Clara, the voice was louder now, unmistakably Edward's. But it wasn't just his voice. It was layered, twisted, distorted, as if there were 100 voices speaking at once. The butcher shop seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the floorboards creaking, the walls bending inwards. She felt trapped by her own mind, by her own guilt, by the shop that now felt like a living, breathing thing. Had she really killed him? The question echoed through her mind louder than ever. She could no longer trust her memories. She had been so sure, so confident in her innocence. But the truth was slipping away. The whispers, the signs, the flesh that had been butcheretted was all pointing back to her. The ring, the blood, the sausages. It wasn't just a shop anymore. It was a trap, a horrific maze of lies that Clara couldn't escape. She turned, trying to steady herself, and caught sight of something else's small, unmarked door at the back of the shop. It had always been there, but she had never paid it any attention, until now. Something in Clara's gut told her that behind that door lay the answers she was desperately searching for. The final piece of the puzzle. She couldn't avoid it any longer. The shop was alive, and she was part of it now. With trembling hands, she grabbed the handle and pushed the door open. The creaking sound echoed through the shop, sending a chill down her spine. Inside, the room was dark, the only light coming from a single flickering candle on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something that had long since rotted beyond recognition. Clara took a cautious step forward, her heart in her throat and her mind racing. She couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved of their own accord, drawn to the candle. As she reached it, the candlelight revealed something that made her blood run cold. It was a wall covered in pictures, not photographs, but drawing sketches. All of them were twisted depictions of Clara, of Edward, of the butcher's shop, and at the center of each picture was the same thing, a grotesque image of meat, of flesh, of bodies being butchered. Humans. Clara stumbled backward, horrified. Each drawing was more detailed, more grotesque than the last. Edward had been here all along. These sketches, these sickening, warped representations of her actions were his. He had been watching her, guiding her without her knowing. Every step she had taken, every choice she had made had been carefully orchestrated. No, this can't be real," she whispered, her voice breaking. But as she turned to leave, she froze. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crash, locking her in. The whisper started again, this time coming from the pictures on the wall. Edward's voice, the voice of the butcher's shop. "Clara, you belong to me now," the voices chanted, overlapping, until the sound filled her ears, drowning out everything else. "You are part of the legacy. You will never escape." The walls of the room seemed to close in, the drawings shifting, moving as though alive. Clara's mind was spinning, her vision blurring. She couldn't breathe. The truth was suffocating her, wrapping around her like a noose. She had been chosen. She had been part of something so much darker than she ever could have imagined, and now there was no turning back. "Clara, you will carry it on." Clara's mind reeled. She was no longer sure if she was awake or if she was trapped in a nightmare. The voices grew louder, more insistent, as the shop seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Edward's ghost, or whatever he had become, was everywhere. He was the shop, he was the meat, he was the butcher, and she had become a part of it. Desperate, she tried to claw at the door, but the more she struggled, the more it felt like the walls themselves were closing in, compressing her into a corner she couldn't escape. Clara, the voice was no longer just in her head. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the meat itself. It's too late. Her vision blurred, her hands shaking as the weight of her own guilt consumed her. She was a prisoner of the shop, of Edward's legacy, of the flesh that she had helped create. The last thing Clara heard before everything went dark was the sound of her name being whispered again. Clara had discovered the truth. But it had come at a cost. The butcher's shop was no longer just a shop. It was a prison end. Clara was its newest victim. What would happen when the legacy of Edward the butcher fully claimed her? The nightmare was far from over. Clara's body was numb, as if her very soul had been drained by the horrors surrounding her. The butcher's shop had become her prison, a nightmare that gnawed at her every waking moment. There was no escape, no way out. The door to the hidden room where the drawings had been, the twisted sketches of Edward and her own gruesome acts, had locked behind her with a thunderous bang, trapping her in that cold, suffocating space. The whispers, once faint, had grown louder. They were everywhere now. They crawled through the walls, seeping into her skin, filling her ears, taunting her with truths she couldn't escape. She sat in the middle of the shop, her hands pressed to her ears, trying to block out the voices, the pictures, the ring, the meat. It was all coming together now, the reality of it crashing down like a weight she couldn't carry. Edward had planned this. He had known all along. He had watched her, waited for her to fall into the same madness that had consumed him, and now she was part of it. She couldn't remember how long she had been sitting there. The hours blurred together, just like the memories. Her eyes flickered over the butcher's tools on the counter, the knives that she had once used to carve meat, but now they seemed like instruments of torture. Her mind began to unravel further. What had she really done? What was real? What was a hallucination? Clara's eyes fell on the small rusted box she had found earlier, buried beneath a pile of scraps in the corner of the room. It had been there since she first arrived, hidden, out of sight, a relic of the past. Her fingers ached to open it, to see what secrets it might hold. Maybe it could explain everything. Maybe it could finally give her the answers she so desperately needed. With shaking hands, she grabbed the box and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in old yellowed paper, was a small, delicate book. Clara's heart skipped as she pulled it out. The cover was worn, the edges frayed with age, but the title was unmistakable: The Legacy of Butchers. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a book. This was the key. The very thing Edward had been hiding from her, the thing she had been too blind to see. She opened it, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the brittle pages. Each page was filled with the same sickening, twisted drawings she had seen earlier in the hidden room. The meat, the blood, the bodies. But this time, the drawings were different. They were older. The faces depicted in the sketches weren't just hers and Edward's. They were faces of others' faces she didn't recognize. And as Clara read the captions beneath each picture, her stomach turned. The ritual begins. The blood of the butcher, the flesh of the beast, and the sacrifice to the shop. To continue the legacy, one must take the place of the butcher. Clara's mind reeled. The book spoke of a twisted tradition that had been passed down through generations, an unholy ritual, a dark legacy of butchers who had made sacrifices to keep the shop alive, to keep the meat flowing, to feed the hunger that the shop demanded. It wasn't just about slaughtering animals. It was about feeding something far darker. And then Clara saw its final, horrifying line. The butcher's bride will carry the bloodline. She will bear the burden of the legacy. And when the time comes, she will take her place. The words hit her like a slap to the face. She had always been a part of this. The butcher's bride. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized the terrifying truth. Edward hadn't just manipulated her into continuing his work. She was the one chosen. She was always meant to carry on the legacy, to become the next butcher, to butcher not just animals but people. She slammed the book shut, gasping for air, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She was part of a ritual, part of a family's sick tradition. She had been groomed for this moment, manipulated by Edward and his twisted, calculated plan. Her heart pounded in her chest as the room seemed to spin. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. They were all around her now, voices from the past, from the other butchers who had come before her. They were calling her, urging her to continue, to take her place. But Clara couldn't. She couldn't do it. She refused. Clara pushed herself to her feet, determined to fight, determined to break free from this nightmare. She grabbed the nearest knife, her hands slick with sweat, her grip tight. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out the whispers. She had to escape. There had to be a way out. She bolted toward the door again, but this time, the door was different. It wasn't locked. It was wide open, the dim light from the outside flooding the room. Clara took a step forward, but the moment she crossed the threshold, she stopped. The world outside wasn't what it should have been. It was darker. The streetlights were dim, flickering erratically. The town, which had once felt so familiar, now seemed like a ghost town, empty, dead. The buildings were decayed, the pavement cracked, the air smelled of rot and decay. It wasn't real. None of it was real. Clara spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The butcher shop was no longer just a shop. It was a part of the town, a part of everything. She was trapped in a world that wasn't hers. It was Edward's world, the legacy's world. Clara. She turned to see Edward standing in the doorway, his pale face twisted into a sickening grin. He was more than just a ghost now. He was a part of the shop, a part of the ritual, the legacy. "You can't escape, Clara," he said, his voice cold and final. "The shop will always have its butcher. Clara's." Vision blurred, her body shaking as the last remnants of her sanity unraveled. She had become the butcher's bride, and now she was nothing but a part of the dark legacy that would never end. Clara thought she had escaped, but the town the shop was never going to let her go. The legacy had claimed her, and now she was trapped in a nightmare that would never end. Would she finally embrace her fate, or would the legacy destroy her completely? Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she stood in the doorway, her mind spinning with the sickening realization that she was no longer just the butcher's breed. She was a part of the legacy, a cog in the twisted machine that had been passed down for generations. The whispers had grown louder, but now they felt distant, echoing from somewhere deep within the shop. She could almost feel Edward's presence, hovering over her like a shadow. "Clara," the voice came again, cold and insistent. It didn't feel like it was coming from outside the shop anymore. It was in her mind. Clara pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block it out. She couldn't think, she couldn't breathe. The weight of the book, the legacy, the blood on her hands, it was too much. She tried to move, but the ground beneath her felt unstable, like it was shifting, rearranging itself. She stumbled backward, her eyes darting from one corner of the butcher shop to the other, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The open door that had once been her escape was now shut. Tight. The shop had changed. Clara's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of everything. The drawings, the book, the blood-stained ring, Edward. She couldn't escape it. It was all real. She backed away from the butcher's table, but the cold, hollow feeling in her chest only grew stronger. This place, this shop, wasn't just a shop. It was a prison, a sacrifice. "Clara, you know what you have to do." The voice was a whisper now, as if Edward were standing just behind her, his breath cold against her neck. But she refused to turn around. She wasn't ready to face him out like this. She had to know. She had to know the truth, the real truth. The one Edward had been hiding from her all along. She turned slowly, the knife still gripped tightly in her hand. She needed answers, anything, to make sense of this madness. Her gaze landed on the small, unmarked door she had avoided before. It was now standing wide open, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. She stepped forward, her feet heavy with the weight of the decision she was about to make. The air was thick with the stench of rot, but there was something else, now something darker. She hesitated for a moment before crossing the threshold into the unknown. The room was small, darker than the rest of the shop. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of meat, they were filled with jars, dozens of jars. Some were small, others large, and each one contained something that made Clara's stomach churn. The jars were filled with organs, liver, heart, intestines, all preserved in liquid. But it wasn't just animal organs. Some of them were human. Clara's legs almost gave out as she staggered back. She grabbed the nearest shelf to steady herself, her heart racing. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. This was the butcher's real work. The blood on the knives, the human meat, the sacrifices. Her eyes scanned the room, falling on a particular jar in the corner. It was larger than the others, filled with a murky liquid, but inside, she could make out the unmistakable shape of a human hand. Clara's breath hitched as she realized what she was looking at. It wasn't just Edward's legacy. It was a ritual, a twisted, ancient practice that had been passed down from one butcher to the next. Her hand trembled as she reached out for the jar. The moment her fingers brushed the cool glass, she heard the faintest sound behind her. Clara, the whisper, was almost drowned out by the rushing in her ears, but it was unmistakable. This time, it wasn't just Edward's voice. It was hers. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was part of the legacy. She had always been part of it. The walls around her seemed to shift, and Clara turned to see the same blood-stained butcher's knives she had used for years now, covered in the very same blood she had been forced to spill. The shop wasn't just a business. It was a vessel, a living, breathing thing that consumed the butcher's soul with each new sacrifice. She dropped to her knees, the weight of the truth crushing her chest. She was the next sacrifice. She had been chosen all along. "Edward, you." She couldn't form the words, the truth too painful to accept. The shop had been designed to consume her, to break her down until there was nothing left but the butcher. She wasn't just the bride. She was the next in line, the next to take the mantle of the butcher. Edward's voice filled the room, echoing, but now was more than a whisper. It was a command. "You're ready, Clara. The shop has claimed you, it always has." Clara's mind was spinning. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. She tried to stand but collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching at her chest. The shop was alive, feeding on her fear, feeding on her desperation. The door to the shop slammed shut again, a sound of it locking echoing in her ears. Clara's vision blurred as she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, but there was something different this time, something alive. A figure stepped into the doorway, his face shrouded in shadows. "Clara," the voice said again, but this time it wasn't Edward. It was a new voice, a familiar voice. "Father?" Clara whispered, her heart stopping in her chest. The figure moved closer, revealing a man she hadn't seen in years, her father. But the shocking truth about Clara's family was far worse than she could have imagined. The butcher's legacy didn't just belong to Edward. It had been passed down for generations, and Clara was next in line. But what would happen when she discovered who the real puppet master had been all along? Clara's mind was a labyrinth, twisted and broken, every turn leading her further into a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her father standing in front of her, alive, after all these years, was the last piece of the puzzle, but instead of providing answers, he only deepened the horror. The butcher's legacy was his. It had been passed down from him to Edward, and now it was being forced onto Clara. The shop was suffocating her, the walls closing in like a noose tightening around her throat. Every corner she turned, every step she took, seemed to draw her deeper into the madness. The whispers were louder now, as if the shop itself was alive, breathing, waiting for her to become one with it. "Father," her voice broke, barely a whisper, trembling as she stared at the figure before her. You're alive. But why? How?" Her father, once a proud man with the same twisted gleam in his eyes that Edward had, smiled coldly, his lips curling in a knowing grin. "I was never dead, Clara. You and Edward just thought I was." Clara's breath hitched as the realization slowly sank in. Her father had been the first butcher, the first to carry the legacy of blood and flesh that had been passed down like a dark inheritance. Edward had taken over from him, but now it was Clara's turn. The butcher's bride, the one who would continue the cycle of death, of sacrifice, of meat that wasn't just animal. "No, Clara," whispered, stepping back. "This isn't real. Two didn't choose this. I didn't choose you, no one chooses it, Clara." Her father interrupted, his voice low, almost comforting in its coldness. "It chooses you. You think you've been living your life in control, but it's all been part of the plan. From the moment you stepped into this shop, you were part of the legacy. You are the last of the line, Clara, the final piece to complete the butcher's cycle." Her father's words sliced through her, each syllable like a blade, carving away at the last remnants of her sanity. The weight of the truth crashed down on her. It had always been this way. She had never truly been free. The shop had claimed her long before Edward, long before she even knew what she was stepping into. She had been born into it. "You think you are different, don't you?" Her father's voice was mocking now, filled with dark amusement. "You think you are better than me, than Edward. But in the end, Clara, you'll see. You'll understand. This shop owns you. It always has." Clara's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. Her hands gripped the cold tile, the bitter truth sinking in. She wasn't escaping this. She had been groomed for this moment, for this role. The butcher's bride. The one who would carry on the blood-soaked tradition. "No," she gasped again, her voice barely a whisper. I can't be you. I won't be you." Her father crouched in front of her, his hand reaching out to gently tilt her chin upward, forcing her to meet his eyes. His gaze was as cold as ever, empty of warmth. "You will be, Clara. There's no escaping it. The meat calls to you. The legacy calls to you." Clara recoiled from his touch, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in closer, his breath cold against her face. "You've already started, Clara. Do you remember the sausages, the meat you've been preparing? The faces you've been carving into the flesh, thinking it was just business. It's been happening all along, even when you thought you were in control." Clara's heart stopped, her stomach twisted as the horrifying realization swept over her like ice water. The meat, the customers, the blood, it was all part of the ritual, part of the plan that she had unknowingly embraced. The faces, the shapes in the meat weren't random, they were human. Her father stood up, stepping back as he gestured around the shop. "Look around, Clara. This is your legacy now. The walls, the knives, the flesh. It's yours. It's always been yours." Clara's mind fractured as she looked around the shop. Familiar walls now seemed alien, the butcher's tools gleaming with a sinister sheen. She was part of it. She had always been part of it. The floor beneath her shifted again, the walls seeming to close in as the whispers grew louder. "Clara, Clara!" Her breath quickened, her hands clutching her chest as she gasped for air. She couldn't breathe. The shop was alive, alive with the hunger for more, the hunger that had been passed from butcher to butcher, from generation to generation. Now it was hers. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't become what her father and Edward had become. She couldn't live this life of blood and death. She had to fight. She had to fight for her soul. Her father's voice echoed again, more insistent. "You can't run, Clara. You've already chosen. The shop is yours." "No," she whispered, the word breaking free from her chest with an unexpected ferocity. "I will never be you. I will never be this." With every ounce of strength she had left, Clara pushed herself to her feet. Her father's figure stood in the doorway, blocking her exit, his grin widening as she tried to escape. The door wouldn't open. "Clara." He spoke her name as if it were a command, his voice full of triumph. "You cannot escape your fate. You are the butcher now." Clara's mind raced as she took in the horrible truth. She was trapped by the legacy, by the cycle, by the shop itself. The walls were closing in. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Every step she took led her deeper into the same madness that had consumed her father, and Edward, and so many others before her. But just as she thought she might break completely, a strange clarity washed over her. She couldn't be the butcher. She couldn't carry on the legacy. She had to destroy it. With one last, desperate cry, Clara turned, running toward the nearest butcher's knife, her heart pounding as she grabbed it. But Clara wasn't ready for the consequences of her decision. Destroying the butcher's legacy wasn't just about breaking free, it was about shattering something that had been centuries in the making. What would Clara do when she finally confronted the cost of her freedom? Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the butcher's knife. The weight of it felt like an anchor, dragging her into the very depths of a nightmare that she couldn't escape. The air in the shop was thick with fear and guilt, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her own breathing, ragged and strained. She had made her choice. She had refused to become what her father and Edward had been. She had rejected the butcher's legacy that had been passed down from one generation to the next, each butcher more twisted than the last. But now, there was no turning back. Clara stood at the center of the shop, the knife still in her hand, staring at the walls, the knives, the blood-stained apron that hung like a macabre trophy. The shop was no longer just a place of work. It was a prison, a living, breathing entity that had consumed her, had shaped her, had molded her into something unrecognizable. But she had to destroy it, destroy everything. She turned toward the large steel meat grinder in the corner of the room, the one she had used countless times to prepare the flesh, to grind the meat. The whirring sound of it had once been comforting, the familiar hum of a job well done. But now, it felt like the tool of death it truly was. It was the heart of the shop, the place where everything had come. Together, the flesh, the blood, the bodies. She had to destroy it. With each step, Clara's resolve grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for her own life now, she was fighting for her soul, for the chance to break free from the horrors of the butcher's shop, from the twisted cycle that had claimed her, that had claimed Edward, that had claimed her father. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls, but Clara didn't flinch. She didn't look back. She wasn't running anymore. She was fighting. As she approached the meat grinder, the voices began again, the whispers. Edward's voice, her father's voice, the shop's voice. Clara, the whispers were no longer just in her head. They were coming from the walls, from the meat, from the very air itself. "You can't escape, Clara. You belong here." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. She had made her choice. She wasn't going to let the legacy claim her. She wasn't going to let the shop win. With a forceful swing, Clara thrust the knife into the meat grinder, severing the connection. The grinding stopped, but the whispers didn't. Instead, they grew louder, more frantic. The room around her seemed to pulse with energy, the walls trembling with something dark, something alive. The shop wasn't just a place, it was a living force. And as Clara stood there, the realization hit. Her the shop had never been about the meat. It was about control. It was about power. Edward hadn't just been feeding people. He had been feeding the shop itself, feeding it until it was strong enough to take control of its next victim. Clara wasn't just part of the legacy. She had been bred for it. She had been groomed to take her place just like every butcher before her. Her father had known. Edward had known. And now Clara understood. The shop was a force that needed to be fed, needed to grow, needed to claim someone like her. But she couldn't give in. She wouldn't give in. She gripped the knife tighter, the steel cold against her palm. The whispers intensified, becoming a chorus of voices, each one pulling her toward the center of the shop. She could feel the energy of the shop wrapping around her, constricting, suffocating. Clara Edwards' voice came again, but this time, it wasn't just his voice. It was everyone who had ever been consumed by the shop. You can't fight it. You're one of us now. Her vision blurred. The shop was collapsing in on her, its walls closing in. The knives, the blood, the drawing set was all consuming her, pulling her into the very heart of the butcher's legacy. She had to stop it. She had to end it before it swallowed her whole. The knife in her hand seemed to vibrate with energy. Clara felt it, the power of the shop. It was a dark, pulsing force that had been feeding on her family, on the generations before her. She could feel it in her bones, in her very blood. Clara took one last desperate breath. She wasn't going to let the shop win. She wasn't going to let the legacy claim her. With one final, furious thrust, she plunged the knife into the center of the butcher's table, slamming it into the wood with all her strength. The room seemed to quake, the walls groaning as if the very foundation of the shop were being torn apart. The whispers stopped. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Clara stood there, panting, her body trembling with exhaustion, her mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The shop felt different now still, empty and quiet. The presence that had consumed her, that had surrounded her for so long, was gone. She was free, or at least she thought she was. Clara took a tentative step toward the door, but before she could reach for the handle, she felt a chill run down her spine. The door, which had been wide open just moments ago, was now closed, and there, standing in front of her, was Edward. His face was twisted, pale, and his eyes were empty, lifeless. He had come back. But this time, he wasn't the butcher. He was the butcher's ghost. Clara thought she had broken free from the butcher's legacy, but the horrors of her past weren't finished with her yet. As the legacy came back to claim her, she had no choice but to face the truth. There was no escaping the butcher's bride. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she stood before the door, frozen in place. Edward was back, the butcher's ghost more powerful, more vengeful than ever, stood just beyond the threshold, his hollow eyes staring straight through her. She had thought she was free. She had thought the butcher's legacy had been destroyed when she severed the connection, when she drove the knife deep into the heart of the shop, but she was wrong. "You can't escape," Edward's voice rasped, the words slicing through the silence like a blade. It was the same voice, but different, darker, colder, more commanding. Clara felt the weight of his presence pressing against her, pushing her back toward the center of the room. Her body trembled, but she fought to hold her ground. The shop was silent, no longer alive with the whispers of the past, but the suffocating presence of Edward off the legacy still lingered, threatening to consume her once more. "I've already escaped," Clara said, her voice shaky but defiant. "I've destroyed everything. The shop, the legacy. It's over." Edward stepped closer, his face twisting into a grotesque smile. "You think you've won? You think it's over? You were always part of this. You were born to carry on the legacy just like I was. The shop doesn't let go. It never does." Clara's mind raced, the room spinning as she tried to process his words. She had destroyed the butcher's tools, severed the connection to the legacy, but this felt different. She wasn't sure if it was Edward standing in front of her anymore. He looked like him, but something was off. He wasn't just a man. He was a manifestation of the butcher's will, something born from the meat, from the blood, from the history of the shop itself. Clara Edwards. Voice grew softer, almost tender. "Don't you see? You are the butcher. It's always been you. You've been preparing for this your whole life. This shop, this place, it's in your blood." The words hit her like a hammer, in her blood. Clara's eyes flickered to the butcher's nivosome still covered in blood, others gleaming in the dim light. The shop had always been a part of her. She had been raised in its shadow, unknowingly trained for a life she couldn't escape. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she destroyed, the legacy had already taken root. But she wasn't going to let him win. She took a deep breath, stepping forward with newfound resolve. "I'm not you. I won't be you." Edward's smile faltered for the first time. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something doubt. Clara could see it in his eyes. The butcher's hold on her was weakening. He had been feeding on her guilt, her fear, her own sense of helplessness, but now Clara was starting to see the truth. The shop had no power over her anymore. She reached for the knife, the one she had used to carve the meat, to prepare the sacrifices. But this time she wasn't holding it as the butcher's bride. This time it was her weapon, her freedom. "You were wrong, Edward," she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "The shop doesn't own me. It never did." Edward's expression darkened, the malice returning to his face. "You think you've won? You think you've broken the cycle? You can't escape. You're mine. You always have been." The air seemed to thicken, the room closing in around them. But Clara was no longer afraid. She had made her choice. She was done with the butcher's legacy. She was done with Edward. With a swift motion, she plunged the knife into the butcher's table, the sound of the blade sinking, into the wood echoing through the room. The walls trembled, and for a moment, Clara thought the shop might collapse entirely. But instead, there was a sudden, deafening silence. Edward's form wavered, his ghostly figure flickering like a candle about to be extinguished. Clara stood tall, watching as the figure began to dissolve into nothingness. The shop, once alive with the whispers and presence of the butcher's legacy, now felt cold and hollow. It was over. The shop had been feeding on Clara's fear, her guilt, her very essence, but now she had taken back control. Edward's final words hung in the air like a faint memory, fading with the last of his form. "You'll never escape," but his voice trailed off, swallowed by the silence of the room. Clara exhaled a shaky breath as the last of the dark presence faded away. She stood alone in the shop, the butcher's legacy finally destroyed. It was over. But as she turned to walk away, the door that had once been locked was now wide open. For the first time, Clara could see the world outside the world she had been trapped from. The town, the streets, the sky, it was all there, waiting for her. She had freed herself, and now it was time to leave. Clara had destroyed the butcher's legacy. But what would the future hold for her now that she was free from the darkness? Was she truly free, or would the echoes of the shop follow her forever? Final payoff, Clara stepped into the daylight, the door to the butcher's shop finally behind her. The town stretched out before her, untouched by the horrors she had endured. She was free. The weight of the shop's legacy blood, the guilt, the whispers was gone. But as Clara walked, a faint chill ran down her spine. In the distance, the butcher's shop still stood, its windows dark, and just for a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper in the wind. Clara, the legacy, had tried to claim her, to consume her, but Clara had broken it, or so she thought. The whispers of the butcher's legacy would never fully fade. It would always follow her, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to slip. Because freedom, she realized too late, was never truly hers to keep. The butcher's bride was always a part of the Chopin and always would be.